All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming today to our fourth installment of our new book series. Today we are joined by Vanessa Wilkie, and she will be joined by Amy Froide in discussion of her new work. I'm just going to briefly introduce both of our guests today and then turn it over to them. So, Dr. Vanessa Wilkie is the head of the Huntington Library Curatorial Department and curates the library's renowned collections of medieval manuscripts and British history. She earned her PhD in British history from the University of California at Riverside and was a visiting assistant professor of history at the University of Redlands before moving to the Huntington in 2013. Wilkie has curated two exhibitions, Magna Carta, Law and Legend, and The Reformation from the Word to the World. She has published on female editorial practices, patronage, and death rituals, and of course today we are here to discuss her book, A Woman of Influence, The Spectacular Rise of Alice Spencer in Tudor England. And so she will be in discussion with Amy Froide. Amy is professor of history and the chair of history department at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And she is the author of several books on women in early modern England. So with that, I'll turn it over to you all.
Thank you, Amanda. It's great to be here with Vanessa, and I feel very honored that she asked me to be in conversation with her about her new book. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I just happen to have a copy behind me. You are in for a treat if you have not had a chance to read Vanessa's book yet, and hopefully our conversation will give you a little taster of what's in store. I think one of the most important things for me as a historian of early modern Britain and women is that Vanessa is showing us how to write women's history and how to write family history from the woman's perspective, right? A matrilineal history. So I'm really excited to talk about that today with her. But I actually thought we should back up a sec, Vanessa, and talk about how did you what were your goals as you began to think about turning this into a book, and why did you choose the trade route? So that could be part of what you say in terms of maybe as we think about when we have goals for projects, what appropriate routes there are for them.
That's so interesting. I never really thought about it as goals, although I think we all should think about the goals of our writing. So often it's, I've done this research, or this is the thing I'm interested in. And so it's a little driven by what we want to do instead of, for this book, originally when I did the research, it was for my dissertation. So my goal was to get a PhD. And then my goal, initially when I expected to, become a professor and go up for tenure, my goal was to write a book that would get me tenure. But when I had this opportunity to kind of explore this alternate career path as a curator, I pretty quickly realized I don't go up for tenure. I can write I've got this, giant mountain of research. I've thought through a lot of these things, but I can write any kind of book I want. And I think, it took me a little while at the Huntington to get my footing. But I started to realize that I have this opportunity where I work so closely with all of you on the screen right now, and our colleagues. So I get to be informed and participate in those conversations, those academic conversations. But most of the time when I'm talking to people about history, it's a public audience. It's the Huntington crowd. So I felt like writing a book like this was allowing me to make a bridge between that academic side of the Huntington and the very public side of the Huntington. And so my goal started to become more about saying translating isn't quite right, but kind of transforming the conversations that I'm part of in the reading room or in my office with readers, and opening that up for the bigger audience that comes to the Huntington. And trade was the way for me to be able to do that. And pretty quickly along that process, realizing that trade allowed me to have a very low price point for books. Like my hardback book was less than $30. And so that was something I really cared a lot. I started to care more and more about as I was exploring the possibility of there's so many, we often think the barrier of entry to reading books is that it's written for a very academic audience and there's a lot of historiography in there and the footnotes are intimidating. And that's all true, but I also think the, $150, $200 price point for books is a major barrier to getting our work out there for a broader audience. So the price point became a goal of mine too.
Interesting. So I think that's such a fascinating thing for us to think about is, in our field, the tenure track job, right, is still kind of the prize, but in a way it leads us toward a certain type of writing that ironically may be less accessible to a wider public. And so you had the freedom in a way to say, I really enjoy having conversations about history with the public. I want to write a book that does that. So I hadn't thought about it that way. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
What were you say you didn't have goals, but you did. So
I did have goals. Yeah. Yeah.
So in writing Alice Spencer's story, right, you made a lot of decisions about how to write that story. And I remember I was very lucky to be with Vanessa last year at the Huntington. And so I got to hear a lot about her process in writing this book, and so maybe she'll share a few vignettes with us. But one of my favorite anecdotes, Vanessa, is you talking about writing at your kitchen table and telling yourself, I've got to write this in a way that is a story that makes sense to people. And so you would literally kind of, what was it? You would like talk out loud, talk the story.
Yeah, I get
through.
a glass of wine and hold it like I'm, or, sometimes water, but usually wine because it was night. And I'd start talking my way into the book because I found, when you sit down, you start writing and you're looking at a Word document, you kind of take on this scholarly tone in your writing that's different than your conversational tone. And when I would submit early drafts to my agent, she would say like, yeah, this, I can see the ideas are there, but I don't know who you think you're talking to. Like nobody talks this way. This is not conversational for most people. Of course, in my mind, I was talking to all of you. And so this is how we talk to each other. So my agent kind of coached me to say like, you need to just imagine that you've just left the archive and you go and meet your friends at a pub and you order a beer, you order a glass of wine, you sit there and you say, I had the most interesting day. I read this source and it made me realize this, and then this happened, and then this happened. And that's the tone that you need to write with. And I often had trouble kind of getting into that rhythm, but if I started talking out loud and writing down what I was saying, it became more conversational and colloquial than it was when I just was thinking in text, I guess.
And if you read Vanessa's book, it is very conversational. Maybe it's because I know the author, right? But I felt your voice leading me through this story of this family. And I think I said to you that I was in good hands, that it was a confident telling and a persuasive telling of how we look at sources to reveal and illuminate women's lives, especially women's lives when it comes to legal issues and family drama. So that confident hand was really helpful to me as a reader. So I love that you thought about that. Let's talk about Alice.
Talk about Alice. Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about Alice. Yeah, she's a delight.
Well, is she a delight?
No.
This is another thing that women's historians, I think we really have to think about, right? How do you write about complicated women? And so what did you think about, what parts of Alice's life do I want to focus on and reveal, and what does that tell us about her as a real woman who lived in the past?
I think part of it was when I wrote my dissertation, it was thematic. The chapters were thematic, and it was much more about like her relationship with her three daughters. And they were like always kind of in orbit of each other in each of these themes of literary patronage and political patronage and the Castlehaven trials and death ritual, or, legacy constructing. But when I decided to write this book, a trade book instead, I had to do it chronologically and not thematically, so it would make sense. And so I kind of recast all of my my sources to see where are the pieces of her life that I have the most information about. And then I had to use those as kind of anchor points. And then I had to piece together, okay, so in the 1610s, I don't have a ton about her, but I know what's happening in the 1610s. So I have a background, like a really rich background to situate her against and make some educated guesses about, like informed speculation about what she would have been doing, because I know what the norm for women like her would be. And then those places where I felt like my sources were a little skimpy, that's where I really relied on like secondary work to fill in those gaps. And it really allowed me to see Alice quite differently than I did when I was thinking about her thematically, because I could see her age in a way that you can't when you're situating a historical subject, whether it's a man or a woman, in a moment, you might think about what their age is, but you're not thinking about how their development over the trajectory of their life might impact things. So putting her against this wider backdrop and then watching her age allowed me to hypothesize that she might handle something in the 1630s differently than she would have in the 1590s. And I think that helped me make her more complex and more human, because I was thinking about her aging process a lot more.
You do. It comes across in the writing. She learns, right, from past situations, and it doesn't mean she's always perfect in how she handles things, but you can see her kind of absorbing that experience and then being able to apply it, right, to these later situations. And I think you did that really well. I think it is the life of a woman, across time, and that really comes across, and her interactions with her different family members, right, vary across her life cycle.
Yeah. And it's that, I mean, we all know that from, Barbara Harris's work and your work and other, people's work that show what this process looks like at a really big meta level. And I felt like, using Alice as a vehicle allowed me to map some of that onto an individual figure and see what that would look like on the ground.
Now you wear the historiography very lightly, as your agent probably wanted you to do, and yet an alert reader will see it everywhere. So I have to admit that the way this group would read the book is different from perhaps a person in the airport picking it up, right? You will see all of Barbara Harris's work and the influence there. Can you talk about that? How do we write scholarly work in a way that is accessible and yet is still kind of, tipping its hat to all the work that has kind of that you're sitting on the shoulders of, right? And I should say to all of you that Vanessa and I had this back and forth last year about whether this book, A Woman of Influence, was scholarship or whether it was something different. And Vanessa made a decision on what she feels comfortable calling it. I think it's scholarship, but it's not my book.
What you said last year really stuck with me, because I kept saying it's informed by scholarship and it's scholarly, but it's not scholarship. And you really pushed back on that. And I think about it all the time. And I think one of the reasons why in the end, there's no way I could have written this without having read all of, the 40-page bibliography that's in the back of it and then some. So, I mean, I don't know how people feel comfortable, like other, trade writers feel comfortable just picking a subject. And that's the academic side, I think, that's grilled in. Like, you got to make sure that you know whose shoulders you're standing on to make those arguments. And normally you put a little bit of that in the text and then you put a lot of it in the footnotes. And that was not acceptable for this project. With my press, they didn't want that, but we did agree that I could have a massive bibliography in the back. And that ultimately is how I didn't just start being very comfortable with that style of writing. And there were a lot of early drafts that I got back with big like X's over sections going, yep, this is where you're talking to the people in your footnotes. You're not talking to your reader. And, that kind of language was really helpful for me. Like, yep, this paragraph I wrote for all of you, I didn't write it for, the reader at the airport. And if my primary audience is the reader at the airport, I have to trust that we're all cool. And as long as I put it in the footnote, in the bibliography, then that's going to be okay. So I was super uncomfortable with that for a long time. And then I started to realize that the scholarship is baked in to, it's just one of the ingredients that's in the book. And it doesn't have to be like the icing on the cake kind of thing. It can be baked into the cake. So that getting more comfortable with that helped me a lot to kind of push some of that below the surface so that I know it's there and you all know it's there. But, a lot of readers that buy it at the Huntington gift shop don't have to be hit over the head with it. And so one of the reasons why I think I never felt comfortable calling this a work of scholarship is because I'm not, I'm informed by those debates, and I think I'm making arguments and points along the way, but the primary function of my book is not to further a scholarly debate. And I feel like that's what historiography is doing. And because I'm not engaging directly and overtly in a historiographical debate, then I don't feel comfortable calling this scholarship.
So I love your culinary metaphors. So the baked in versus the icing
baked right in there, like some eggs and a dash of historiography.
Yeah. One could argue that the baked in is actually more fundamental, right? So I think we're talking about the difference between argument driven and narrative driven history, right?
Yeah.
And how a lot of us really want to do both. Or maybe that I'm just projecting my own insecurities. But the thing I'm thinking about is how I've said to you that I think you in this book, A Woman of Influence, do actually further a lot of arguments about women's history, maybe in, as you say, like more implicit ways, but a reader will certainly come away with the understanding that women were able to manipulate the common law, that women were able to be agents for their families, that the way women think about family, of course, is different perhaps than their male family members, right? And so if and quite a few other arguments, but I think that they do come through in a way that's maybe because you're a skillful writer of those things. And so I would say to all of you in the audience, it's a model for us to think about how to do that kind of work as well. So let's talk about Alice as a mother. Right, we all have moms here. What kind of mother figure did you end up seeing her as? For I think a lot of our work on motherhood in the early modern period is talking about women taking care of small children or younger children, right? And I think here you have a portrait of a later time period in that mother-daughter life cycle.
Yeah, I think actually, you see, I first came to know Alice through the Castlehaven trials. And so, and then I worked backwards, like in my early research, it was the Castlehaven trials that I initiated, or I initially started working on. And my plan was to write about the Countess of Castlehaven. And then just because there was such a dearth of material about her, and the more I started looking at the trials, the more I realized, I think her mother's doing a lot behind the scenes. So who is this woman? And then to make sense of who she was, I worked backwards, and then I retold the story going forward. And so I first met Alice as an older mother, and in my mind, her relationship, her role as a mother was the most important part of my encounter with her. So then I wanted to see how motherhood changed for her over time. And I think one of the things that doesn't make it into this book, but I think it was more in my early research in my dissertation, is that she had a very different relationship with each of her daughters. And that allowed me to see her, like, to think about the role of motherhood in a more complicated way than we often do see it in the historiography. But for the sake of this story, a lot of that had to go, just because it became background story, or it was confusing to the editors and things like that, because I go on these tangents about like Alice and one daughter versus Alice and another daughter, and they're like, yeah, this is out of time, so that has to live someplace else. So Alice had to become kind of a main character for this, but I do think that Alice's life and the records about her allow us to think about motherhood not as a static category for women, even a static category that changes with age, but that, you know, when she was in her 60s, she had a very different relationship with each of her children. And then they in turn had different relationships with her, but also with their own children as a result of it, because it's, you know, multi-generational, not a nuclear family structure. So I think it helps complicate those ideas of what the role and responsibilities of mothers are over time in this period. Yeah,
that's like definitely true. I do think her different relationship with the different daughters does still come through a little bit.
yeah,
Would have been someone who would definitely read more about that, but it does come through in the book. And I hadn't thought about that, you know, it's not just about who the mother is, you know, the mothering is going to change depending upon the relationship with that child, right?
yeah.
So that's really interesting. Yeah, it's a dialectic.
Yeah.
It's not
That
just
was one of the things always I was interested in, was thinking about, you know, there's just so much important work that was done in the 80s and 90s about the roles, like defining the roles of women in the early modern period. And I felt like that has been so well established at this point that it was time to shift focus a little bit and think about the relationships within families, not just the roles within families. And then, of course, my dream was to be able to do something about siblings, and that just became really hard because there weren't sources for these particular women that allowed me to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about sources a little bit?
Yeah.
Obviously you started
Always.
with Huntington sources, and which is kind of exciting to think that's where your work started, and where you are now. But maybe also the challenges and opportunities of working in private collections, in your case, collections owned by the aristocracy today.
Yeah. So the current Earl and Countess of Derby, they have a private curator who read my dissertation and came to the Huntington. He got a fellowship and he came to the Huntington. And then we started talking. And so then I went to their estate, to Knowsley Hall, where Alice used to live. And they have a little bit of a library left. And they've got this one, just completely wild decorated manuscript that was made for Alice when her youngest daughter died. And it's never been published, and it's been in their private collections since it was made. It moved about. I mean, it hit the market a little bit, but it's always been in private collections. So getting to see that helped me think about all these things, Alice and her daughter and death, in a totally different way. And they were extremely supportive. They were very thrilled that somebody was writing a book about their family. They were thrilled that academics were paying attention to their family history. So they really opened up their home to me, but they also did not meddle at all. They didn't ever ask to see anything. They never tried to influence anything that I was writing. And then it's strange because, you know, the Spencer family and the Stanley family that are central and to me in the 16th and 17th century, but they're obviously still around today, and they actually have a relationship with each other today. So Lady Derby asked me to sign a book for Charles Spencer, who's, you know, Lord Spencer, and she wanted to gift it to him, so she did. And then I guess he got kind of upset about it and didn't love the book because I called his family sheep farmers. And I was like, but he didn't tell me this, but Lady Derby was telling me this. I'm like, yeah, but they were sheep farmers. This is not, and I didn't this is not new information. People have looked at the Spencer family. but he was a little prickly about it. And then when Lord Darby was looking at my book, he started laughing and said, "Oh my gosh, you even have it called like the rise of the Spencers, like they were new money." I'm like, 500 years ago, they were new money. This is not brand new information. But he was really proud. Lord Darby was really proud that his family won their title on the battlefield, and that, you know, kind of taking a jab at Charles Spencer that his family had not. And it was just such a, you know, it wasn't mean spirited or anything like that, but it was just a very eye-opening experience for me as a historian to be more mindful of the fact that these are not just figures out of time. They are very much a living history, and they're you know, ancestors to descendants who are still, you know, very involved in thinking about their family histories. So it was just a really important reminder for me as a historian and as a you know, citizen of the world, to think about the impact of. It wouldn't change what I wrote, but I think about it differently. Yeah.
I mean, I think you're right. We go into this profession, usually we're interested in topics and we're looking at people as examples of those topics. We're not thinking them as as relatives, and these
No.
are somebody's ancestors, and perhaps no group more than the British aristocracy would have that kind of relationship and think of something that happened 500 years ago as kind of yesterday, right? You
Yeah,
know.
yeah, it was shocking. It was very, it's almost like the, you know, the dream that we all have is historians, like we want people, like students, to be able to connect with the past and not be off put by centuries. And here I have this, you know, opportunity to talk to people where the past, the 16th century, is very present in their minds. And I have so much respect for that. Like, that's the dream situation, but I was also so confused by it. So it was, you know, a good reminder for me about, like, you know, here's exactly what you hope happens, and I was unprepared for it. Yeah,
It's the opposite of what we have. For them, the past is not a foreign country. Yes.
exactly.
Uh, if you want, I'm sure people would love to hear a little bit more about sources. And I'm going to ask a question that may put you on the spot a little bit, but was there a source that you wished existed that you didn't have to talk about something? Was there something that you said, "Oh, if I just had, you know, this voice or this remnant, it
Yeah.
would, you know," but
Such a
maybe
good
not.
question. I mean, I definitely wish there was more material written from the voice of Anne Stanley, the Countess of Castlehaven. There's so little for her and about her throughout her life. Not, I mean, you know, she's a little bit of a specter in the Castlehaven trials themselves, but in the documentation. But I wish there was more about her. I also wish there was more where Alice talked about explicitly her marriages. You know, there's a really meaty memo that Ellesmere writes about Alice. You know, he's her second husband, and he just hates her. And, you know, from all accounts, she's just really awful to him, and they just, you know, see the world through very different sets of eyes. And he's very explicit towards the end of his life about his feelings, about how much he suffered being married to her. How much he personally suffered. He's quite clear how much he financially gained from the marriage. But I wish that there was something to balance that a little bit, because it's super easy to just use that lens to look at Alice exclusively. And I'm, you know, I kind of feel like that's probably accurate based on the other sources I've seen. But I wish that I could have more of her voice and her feelings towards the men in her life.
That's no, that's those are great examples, right? I think that I'm mindful that we're talking here just a couple of weeks after Natalie Zeman Davis passed away, right? And how influential she was really to all of us, right? In the way we write history. And I was thinking about that with your book too, Vanessa, that, you know, as you say, like, sometimes we're making educated guesses and sometimes using context to fill in. And that, you know, the story you tell is very persuasive, but you can really see how you've been influenced by Davis-esque writing and Davis-esque
Absolutely.
approaches, right?
I don't know how it's hard for me to imagine a path for writing history before we had a language for reading silences in the archive. Like, I just don't know how that was done before. I mean, I see what the books look like before there was that language, and I see what the subjects were and what the subjects weren't. But that just even having a framework for that, I think, makes subjects possible that would never have been possible without her thinking. Like,
Right.
she just built door after door after door, I think.
So any work really on gender or a marginalized group, right, is
Yeah.
going to be indebted to her. So it's fun to think about all of our work as kind of the lineage of that,
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
a lot of ways, right? Um, I'm looking at time, Amanda, and is there a time that you want us to open up this conversation more widely?
It's so nice to see all of you.
It
It's
is
like,
completely up
I
to
feel like
you all.
we should have it's 8:30 in the morning, but like a glass of wine and, talk about sources.
Our mimosas, our
Or mimosas,
mimosas.
coffee. Yeah.
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 I certainly have more things, and Vanessa has more things she can share, but I'd also like to see if um some of our people on the Zoom today might want to ask a question as well.
Yeah, and anyone that does want to ask a question could just raise their hand on Zoom, and then we'll be able to see it.
Oh, great. So I know I've got Michelle and I've got Jess, and I'm not sure which one of you was first. I think
Michelle, go
Jess.
ahead. It's okay.
Okay, you got to the mute button before me. Vanessa, would you call this a feminist biography? I've just been thinking a lot about how we write women's lives, and I feel like I used to be better at writing about women than I am now. And because I would always write their stories through institutions that they contributed to, and the idea of taking a story that projects a woman's point of view and her experience with her children. I find that very compelling. I just read Tom Lake and I love that, the mothers and the daughters. Like, just the idea, like how these relationships sort of are complicated in these moments. But I just wonder if you could talk about your choices and methodologies. And there's always, like, when I was in graduate school in the 90s, it was always, well, you don't want to give too many details about women. We always over biographize women, right? We always are curious about, their domestic life and I feel like we're past that moment where we can touch those things and we can really talk about them. And you talked a little bit about how your process was intended to sort of get at these relationships. So I just wonder if you could talk about it methodologically, because I find that I write a lot less about women than I'd like to. And I don't know, I wonder how you think about feminist biography.
Yeah, that's I've not thought about it explicitly like that. I wouldn't say that I wrote a feminist biography. I would say I wrote feminist narrative nonfiction. And that's the genre that some of that is I was taught to say that my agent and my editor was they never called this a biography. They didn't want to market it like a biography. I was uncomfortable with the idea of writing anything as a biography. I think some of it, and I think I didn't have a good language for my discomfort, but I think it is exactly what you just explained. That a feminist biography can become superfluous in a way that's really harmful, like it shouldn't be. But it's easy to dismiss, especially a biography about a woman no one's ever heard of before. I think they don't do well in the marketplace. Because everyone would be like, I understand why you want a biography of Winston Churchill, but I don't know why you'd want, or Eleanor, Roosevelt, but I don't know why you'd want a biography of this random woman no one's ever heard of before. And I also was uncomfortable with the concept of biography because Alice has such a big personality, and I just didn't want her as a single figure to just suck all the oxygen out of the room. So thinking about it, when my agent gave me the term narrative nonfiction, I felt like that was very liberating because it allowed me to tell a story about the early modern period through Alice's perspective. And so I felt like I was able to do something a little bigger than if I just was focusing exclusively on one person and how she moved through the world, because it made me intentional about trying. I think I was not totally successful in all places with this, but thinking about how, yes, how she impacted the world, but also how her world was impacting her. And that gave it more, it gave the story more significance or meaning than if I was just like, hey, everyone, let me introduce you to this random person, you know. So narrative nonfiction I found to be an extremely helpful, I would definitely say it's feminist narrative nonfiction. But that phrase or that genre of narrative nonfiction was extremely, like, it opened up a lot of opportunities for me to think about. It's the secret wish that I had when I was writing it was that people who are not historians would say that they learned something about, you know, they wouldn't say early modern, Tudor Stuart England. And a few people have written to me and said that they learned a lot about the period through the book. And that meant more to me than if they said I learned a lot about this one person's life, but that they, could see that that's what was happening was very satisfying to me.
That's actually a good segue to my question, because we last spoke about the project when it was not yet out in the world. So I wanted to ask about, about public-facing writing. And I mean, we talked about its challenges, but now that you're on the other side of it, where it's being published, I was just wondering, you're kind of in a position now. I know you're in the midst of it just, coming out and doing publicity, but how do you feel about it at this point? What have your experiences been like talking to non-specialized audiences? Would you do it again?
I think I would only write books like this. Now, there's lots of articles that I would want to, peer review journal articles that I would want to do. But as far as a monograph, I think that I can't imagine writing a book for a university press, although I want other people to do that. We need those books. I want people to write those books. They serve an important purpose for the cultivation of knowledge. But for me, I feel like I'm more comfortable writing in this lane than I am in the other. Not necessarily, and it's a porous divide. It's not two strict lanes, but we often think about it like that. I have found, like, the questions that people have asked at book events, there's things I've never considered. And I've, gave papers about this when I was a graduate student. I wrote my dissertation about it. I've gotten, have had plenty of opportunity. Amy was here, you're at the Huntington, I'm talking your ears off about this. Kathleen and I were talking about it. So it's not that I haven't had lots of opportunity for feedback and discussion, but I find that the questions that people ask at book events are totally different. They come from a totally different perspective. A lot of them are, ahistorical questions. Like, one of the questions someone asked me at a book event once was, how would Alice's life have been different if she had sons, not daughters? Right. And that's not a historical question. That's irrelevant. Like, that's not what happened. So why would I explore that possibility? But I found actually the question was really helpful in realizing I actually don't think her life would have been that much. I mean, the inheritance bit would have been a bit different, but I think she would have been a very similar person and a similar parent with sons or daughters. But that helped, these off the wall, what we would say as academics kind of are off the wall questions, I found to be extremely helpful in humanizing our subjects in a way that I don't know that academic historians are always really mindful of doing. So I guess it's kind of akin, like, I don't teach classes. So I think a lot of the experiences I have with talking to, our public audiences are similar to the experiences that you all have in classrooms when your students will ask questions. And, everybody writes in the acknowledgements of their books, like, how their students shape their thinking. And I think I got that kind of feedback in talking to a broader audience that you probably just get in talking to your students. That we need those ahistorical questions sometimes to think more holistically we don't necessarily have to write a book based on them, but they help us think better. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? I was wondering about that when you were talking about the kind of the voice in your head being the public that you interact with at the Huntington. And is that a different public than what is in the classroom? And I think what you just said was you think they're the same thing, but is that true? Or do you think that if you were writing this with the classroom in mind, would you have written in a different voice? Would there be things that you would include or not include?
Yeah, I think I definitely think they're different. I mean, in that particular aspect of the kinds of questions they ask, I think there's similarities, but I was very, when I was like mentally shopping for my audience, my dream reader voice, or, my reader, I was actually thinking about an aunt of mine who was a high school literature teacher, and she loved teaching Shakespeare, and she taught, mostly she taught the students that were just about to get kicked out of high school. And used, Shakespeare, and she loved the Renaissance because she's like, it's so trashy. These people are so bawdy, like the students love them. So she used that as a hook a lot of ways, or like the naughtiness of the Renaissance period is a hook. And she was just a really vivacious, boisterous, kind of, uppity woman. And so she was not, had no pretension. She did not have an academic lens, really. So she was kind of my dream reader that I was writing for, because she came at the subject already passionate about it. She was always thinking about using what she learned to reach broader audiences. Most of those students probably would never be in any of your classrooms, realistically. They certainly aren't the students that would normally come to the Huntington, or, would, as readers, would come to the Huntington. But they still are, they're still moved and inspired and fired up by the Renaissance. And, teachers, K-12 teachers like my aunt, are the ones that can mobilize those students in a way that, most academics, those aren't the students we're thinking about. So thinking about her was the readership I ultimately, had in mind when I was writing it. Yeah.
If I could add to that, when I read Vanessa's book last spring, I said to her, I actually think this would be great to assign to undergrads. And I said, it's a much more lively take than a textbook. And yet Vanessa weaves so much of the period and the history into it. And so when I'm glad to hear, Vanessa, that people are writing and telling you that they learned a lot about the Tudor period, because I vaguely remember when I said that to you, you were a little surprised that I said I would assign it in class. So or maybe you hadn't thought of it as an undergrad.
No, I just hadn't thought about it. I'm thrilled that you wanted, that's, I want as many people to read all of our books as possible. But I guess I hadn't thought about it like that. It just hadn't occurred to me. But when you said it, I was, grateful and touched by it.
Yeah, because you do an excellent job of bringing in all of that historical context, and maybe the characters drive it, right, a little bit more in a way that a student would kind of get into it.
I think that's where, Michelle, your question about biography, I think that's where thinking about biography can be really useful, because it makes the subject relatable if people can attach themselves to somebody. So while I didn't think about writing a biography, I do think that it is a useful teaching mechanism and thinking mechanism. But I think there can be some pitfalls. You have to be really careful with how you construct biography. And there's a ton written about this too, mostly from literature or literary studies, more than history, I think. But I think it can be biography is so relatable for readers.
I was thinking I wanted to teach it too in my early modern class. I thought it would be a great text for that.
Oh, good. Thanks.
If I could ask a question real quick. Yeah. So you said that, you want to do this again, and it seems like you've really, I don't know how much you can enjoy the process of getting it together, but that you've enjoyed this going in this direction. And I'm wondering, like, for the next time, like, or rather, did you have any lessons learned? Is there something you would do differently the next time? You know, what have you learned from this process that you're going to take forward into the next book?
That's a really good question. I sitting here now comfortably for this, little window of time. I want to say I would worry less about the process, but I don't know that that's realistic because, when it's 11:30 at night and you're typing away and, trying to get something done, the anxiety, we all feel it deep in our bones. But I want to say that this process has become less scary, I guess, now. I was afraid for a long time that maybe I didn't have a book in me. Maybe I wouldn't be able to write a book. And now I know I could, because I did. So it feels like that anxiety is a little, that's dissipated. I don't know that the actual process would be easier, but the fear that I wouldn't be able to do it, or the fear that I couldn't find a way to tell the story that I wanted to tell, I think that exists. Every story is different. Every project is different. There's a little bit of reinventing the wheel, both, intellectually and emotionally, with that. But I definitely feel like I'm less daunted by the idea of doing it than I did the first time. But I also am afraid of being a one-trick pony. My agent and editors have said, like, well, you could just there's a whole bunch of other women, they all can tell a story. And so the person that I keep thinking about, like, if I was going to do a next project, like, I also have to figure, as we all do, like, I have a day job that doesn't allow for this kind of time. Like, it's not on the Huntington clock that I'm writing, right, that I wrote this book. So I want something that's manageable, not easy, but manageable. And I know how to do this, and I know these sources, and I speak this language now. So it's the most natural thing to me would be to write a similar book for another period in time, like kind of use that big framework, but tell a different story with it. But I'm afraid that makes me a one-trick pony. So that's my anxiety about it.
If the trick is good, maybe it's not so bad.
But I think about, so, years ago, I saw this interview in a documentary with Dave Grohl, from Nirvana and the Foo Fighters. And he was saying that, like, the second Foo Fighter album came out and critics were like, oh, Dave Grohl makes another big rock album. It's the same thing over and over again. And his response is like, I'm a drummer from Nirvana. Of course I made a giant rock album. You want me to make like an indie acoustic? Like, what do a rap album? What do you think I'm going to do? And so when he said that, I was like, I'm a feminist historian who writes narrative nonfiction. Of course I'm going to write a feminist history and narrative nonfiction. That's the genre I work in. But I think there's a little bit of, I don't know if it's self-inflicted pressure or if it's broader academic pressure. Like, we feel like we have to take on projects that are different, that lead us to totally different archives or put us in completely different conversations. And for me, I want people to do that because that pushes knowledge. But for me, I'm not sure that's sustainable. So I might be going the Dave Grohl route, and everyone's just it's like early modern elite women all day, all the time. That's my radio station.
But there's a lot of early modern elite women, and I would say, you're extending us beyond the royal family. So thank you for for that contribution. One of the things that might be a fun way to wrap up is, I had asked Vanessa when we were chatting about this. I said you have done a lot of public facing book launch events at Barnes and Noble and other and other sites. But here's an opportunity to chat with British historians, right? In this context that Amanda's provided. So, are there things that you think we'd be more interested in than your Barnes and Noble audience, or things you actually wanted to get our feedback on?
I always want your feedback on things. The thing I think that I care the most about in conversations with academics is about sources and how to read. And your comments about Natalie Zeman Davis, I think, are exactly right in thinking about how to read sources to construct a narrative, more than just thinking about like what you extract and tell a story with. But I think that academics have a particular reverence and care for how to find sources, that not all letters are the same, not all, epistolary dedications should be read the same just because they're in the same genre. So I think talking to my colleagues like this about, the care and thinking about archives and sources, or libraries and sources is a unique conversation to be able to have.
In your book, you were also not able to, just like the historiography has to be light, the source, the methodology discussion has to be light, right? That I could see that being a little frustrating too at times, to not be able to put that in there into the text.
Yeah, sometimes I really would go off the rails because I'd want to really talk about where this material lives and how it was constructed and how it came to be, because that informs how we all read the sources. But that derailed from the narrative. So that part was extremely frustrating for me. And I often, when I'm reading, academic university press books or journal articles, and I can see the author going in like kind of tangential, but like really drilling into explaining how these sources came together and how that informs how you interpret them. It's so satisfying to me. And I envy those paragraphs a lot, because I think it's really important and not something that we should just sweep under the rug and pretend is a natural, easy thing. I don't want to burden broad audiences with that discussion, because they don't necessarily, that's not why they're reading these books. And I respect why they're reading the books the way they are. But I think we have to be, it's one of the reasons why I don't want to champion everyone write trade books, because it's not the right genre for every subject or for every goal. And I think it's really important to protect academic publishing in journal articles and in university presses, so we actually have the space to plot out these really important methodologies that don't exist other places.
I wondered about that. Actually, at my year at the Huntington, there was a lot of discussion about, are you going to write a trade book, or are you going to get an agent? Who's going to write your book? And so all the academics there were thinking about that. But in my discussions with you, Vanessa, I think I got a much better sense of the pros and cons of trade publishing, that it's not for everyone and it's not for every project, and that's okay. And I think that's really refreshing to get that from someone who actually published a trade book, that you've been really honest about what you can do and then what maybe you miss out on. And I think that's probably a more important conversation for us to have in academic conferences, because I think all of us again, maybe this is my baggage, but I think all of us secretly think we should be writing trade books. And so having a more nuanced discussion about that is really important. And that if we all write trade books, then there aren't the academic books. Yeah.
We really need those.
I just want to second that. This has been a fascinating discussion, Vanessa. I haven't heard this kind of nuanced discussion about audiences, trade books, the distinctions, what you gain, what you lose. And so I come out of this not only with even greater admiration for the work you've done, but a better sense of the much larger ecosystems that our writing exists in, and the need for us to be aware of those different ecosystems and be searching for points of connection, and to celebrate times when people build bridges from one kind of scholarly writing to another. It's really been energizing for me to hear you talk about it.
Thanks. Jess and I had talked a lot about, and I think I'm looking forward to your panel at the NACBS about writing as well, because, not every project needs to, you can get a lot of juice out of a single project. And so you can still do the university press book, but you might also be able to do some op-ed writing, or you might be able to, do some long form essay writing, or, there's a whole, it's not a one one and done thing. You know, you can think, we all think with our subjects in lots of different ways. And I think the opportunity, like being more aware of the various opportunities for getting work out there, and that it's not either journal or book or nothing. There's a whole big spectrum. I think that can alleviate some of the pressure as well. I don't want to put you on the spot, Jess, but I don't know if you have anything to say, because you, I know, I think a lot really explicitly about that. So you could save it for NACBS, because I'm going to ask you the same question.
I think we've got 1 or 2 minutes before we wrap up our session. I agree with Kathleen. This has just been a really wonderful and enlightening and kind of, uplifting, I have to say, in a busy week, conversation about process, why we do what we do, why we choose to write in ways we do, or present our research in ways we do. So I really appreciate you getting that conversation started, Vanessa.
Thanks. I feel like you got it started too, because we started talking about this a long time ago. And so it's really, it's through conversations with, like-minded people who think differently, though, or ask different questions. I think that's where we get to this point. I didn't get here by myself by any means. So I get really spoiled because all of you come to visit, and then we get to have these conversations.
Well, and it shows, right, the importance of us gathering in these different institutions like the Huntington, like the Folger, and being able to discuss. I don't think people realize how collaborative our work is, and how much it builds on. That's more clear maybe in other disciplines, but here we're kind of lifting the veil a little bit and showing that. Right?
Yeah. And I want to thank Amanda for creating this space too. You're doing so much work to broaden the conversations at NACBS, and it is really making a difference.
Well, thank you all for participating, because, we can try as much as we want, but if you guys aren't willing to actually take part in these things, it doesn't work. So thank you guys so much.
But it's wonderful to think of NACBS as something that doesn't just happen once a year, that has these ongoing conversations, and it's always fun to see the faces of people that you want to see more than once a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're definitely going to try to do more of that going forward. So we hope to see more of you throughout the year.
Thanks.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you guys both so much. And yeah, so speaking of, our next event's going to be in December. It's going to be Arunima Datta. She's going to be talking about her new work, Waiting on Empire. So we'll get the details up on the site, and it'll be in the newsletter. And so hope to see some of you guys there. But thank you all so much for joining us today. And thank you, Vanessa and Amy, for such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Congrats, Vanessa.
Yeah, thanks very much.
See ya next week.
That was great. Thanks so much.